Waste. Right? That's all that we've talked about really for the past 3 or 4 videos at least, is chemical waste. And what you have to understand is that chemical waste, or hazardous chemical waste, is generated by about every single lab, right? Even though we're an academic institution, we have hazardous waste that we have to dispose of. And we can't just dump that stuff down the drain or pour that stuff out and let it evaporate off in the air. There's certain ways that we have to handle this waste, and we'll let you know when those times happen in our laboratory throughout our courses. But you have to understand that no lab is completely clean. Something, whether it's just one reagent, is going to fall under the category of a hazardous waste, and there's something that you're going to have to do to handle that to make sure that you dispose of it properly. So this hazardous waste, we've talked about OSHA, and yes, OSHA does play a role in this. However, it's also subject to regulations by the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and we've brought them up a couple of times already, right? And this falls under what we call the Resource Conservation and Recovery. Learn how to spell, Tracy. Recovery Act. And we abbreviate this as RCRA, RCRA, okay? All right, so these regulations, EPA has a hand in as well. They want to make sure that you're not dumping hazardous waste out there for people to get poisoned or for aquatic life to be poisoned or whatever the case is. What they have is something that you'll often hear in a laboratory environment called a cradle-to-grave scenario. All right? So a cradle is basically when is that hazardous waste born, and grave means when it's disposed of. So we have to keep track of the hazardous waste from cradle to grave, meaning that when the waste is generated, at that point you need to start tracking it. And when you start tracking it from the time that you generate it to the time that you dispose of it, all of this has to be supported by various forms of paperwork. They want to know who did it, where did it get sent off to, who picked it up, and what did they do once it was disposed of. So you need to think about that in a working laboratory, right? There's all kinds of red tape that's going on. As you are doing your job and producing maybe hazardous waste that has to leave the lab, what goes on behind closed doors that you're not seeing? That waste has to be tagged, it has to be signed off on, it has to be dated, it has to be approved by supervisors and managers. The paperwork trail, or a chain of custody in a way, has to follow through that waste. The people come and will pick up those jugs. Those people have to sign off. Those people have to date it. Those people have to write a description of what they're going to do with it. And then once it gets to the disposal, they're going to have to basically give you detailed information about the date it was disposed of, the time it was disposed of, and the method of disposal. So that way, all of that information can go on file at your location. So if the EPA does come around and this big government agency comes in your doors and says, we want proof, you actually have proof that this was disposed of the right way. The paperwork backs you up. Now, a lot of times, contractors are used. These laboratories are not going to dispose waste of themselves, so what they do is that they hire a contractor, okay? And those contractors are what we would call third party. And those third-party people would visit the laboratory, pick up the waste, and drive off with it. And then a lot of people think that it's their responsibility from that point on, after the waste is dumped or whatever the case is, to take care of it. Now, 40 CFR Part 260. This is a different part of the Code of Federal Regulations, all right? We're not talking about chapter, in a way, 29. We're now looking at 40 instead of 29, and this is Part 60. So under this EPA, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, what you're going to find out is, number one, large companies are the target here. Large companies will typically generate large amounts of waste. And the academic labs are typically what we call a little bit looser. They know that we're going to be generating hazardous waste. They're not as strict on us because the volumes are very small amounts, and we don't fall under certain guidelines of the Part 260 that a large, big manufacturer or chemical plant would do, right? They're very stringent. That's something that this is known for. They're very stringent on what they call the requirements for records and documentation. And I've already kind of given you an example of that, right? As far as hazardous waste is concerned, what goes on, it's like an act of God to get it through and approved, right? The timelines are important. So I'm going to put timeline here. You can't keep the waste forever. You can't hoard it up into a basement and not ever send it off for disposal. They're going to give you a guideline on how long that waste can stay at your location, depending on what the type of waste it is, before it has to be sent out and disposed of. You can't keep it forever and hoard it up because you want to save money, because these contractors, they're going to charge you money in order to dispose of the waste. That's why we have to hire them. So a lot of people think, well, I'll just store it up and then I'll just kind of ship it out all at one time. No, it doesn't work that way. You also need permits. It's not as easy as just calling someone up. If you are going to generate hazardous waste, then those people or your company have to have the proper permits in place in order to handle the waste and dispose of the waste. If you don't have the permit, then you will get fined, you will get written up, and the company will fork out thousands and thousands of dollars because of this mistake. Any processor or contractor that will come in and take the waste from you, they also have to have a permit. So not only do you have to have a permit to handle the waste and to keep the waste on your location for a certain point in time, but the contractor that you hire has to have the proper permits as well in order for this thing to work out. All right? Up here, I'm just going to kind of jot up here to the center of the slide. Up here at number 6, we're going to go on, and the generator of the waste is the overall one that's responsible for the disposal, not the contractor. So this is what all of this led up to, right? I told you that this was cradle to grave just a second ago. And then I said you're going to have to keep track of when it's born to when it's disposed of, and paperwork is required in the whole thing. And then I kind of went through a tangent, and I said, well, we'll talk about contractors. Well, a lot of people think that once the waste goes into the contractor's hands, that it's over. They no longer have to worry about the waste, but that is a lie. This CFR Part 260 specifically says that the generator of the waste, whatever company maybe that you're working for, whatever lab that you're working in, if you are generating the waste, your company, your lab is the one that's responsible to make sure that this waste got disposed of. So if you hire a contractor that comes in and picks your waste up, your job is not over. It's not the contractor's responsibility, believe it or not. It's the lab's responsibility. So the lab has to have some type of confirmation. It has to have something in writing saying that the contractors disposed of the waste on a certain day, on a certain time, and give you descriptions of what happened when that waste was basically disposed of. Okay? It is the generator's responsibility, not the contractor's. So, these contractors, you have to choose them wisely. Don't use someone that you don't know, because they could lie to you and it could come around and bite you in the butt, and you do not want that to go or happen at all, right? Finally, number 7, it says that any of the hazardous waste that you're generating, it cannot go down the sink. Very often, and you might laugh about this, but very often we have a habit of dumping things down the sink because a lot of things do go down the sink. The problem here, though, is that it's hazardous waste, and we can't dump that down the sink. If we are caught dumping hazardous waste down the sink, we will get written up, and sometimes we can even be thrown in jail if it's bad enough. Finally, OSHA. We've talked about OSHA before. OSHA can fine a company. So they can give you a ticket, they can give you a citation, and you have to pay. However, these government organizations cannot close you down. Believe it or not, they have no power to do that. And this is kind of the hot topic of the government organization. We have all of this taxpayer money, and the taxpayer money is going into these government organizations. So if you're working a part-time job, you're getting taxes held out, and your tax money that you're working for is funneling into the EPA and funneling into OSHA. And their job is to go around to make sure that people are being treated safely, that the workplace is safe, and that we're not dumping hazardous waste out into the environment. If they find and discover that that is going on, they have no power to do anything. So people begin to question, well, what's the purpose of them? Right? If the purpose of them is just to go around to be nosy and give you fines, but they can't actually have the power to shut you down, then what's going on here? So that's up for debate. And that's kind of how these government organizations work sometimes. And that's up to you to figure out if you think that these people are actually doing a good job and putting you first and having an active role to play, or what would happen if these government organizations were just not there at all. What if we did away with OSHA? And what if we did away with EPA? Would some of these things still happen? And how out of hand would it get? So that's up to you to make those decisions, not for me, because that's in the world of politics in a way. All right. Next, we want to talk about radioactive waste, right? This is waste that we do include, and radioactive typically gets forgotten about because that's not very common. Radioactive waste is something that we do not have, and many other laboratories that you will work for will not have radioactive waste, but it is a hazardous waste that we have to kind of keep in mind, and we have to handle it differently. So radioactivity can come in two forms. One is what we would call a closed system, and the other one is something that we would call an open system. A closed system is something that you're not going to directly come in contact with. So this would be things like instrumentation. Sometimes instrumentation will have radioactivity on the inside of them. And this radioactivity, we have to treat it like a radioactive reagent because there's radioactive substances on the inside. It might be away from me, it might be in a closed box, but it's on the inside of the equipment. The open system means that the exposure is there. This is a reagent or a chemical that I can expose myself to physically, directly, and come in contact with it. So open system and closed system radioactive reagents and waste can generate in a laboratory, but any type of radioactive material, no matter what it is, they have regulations mainly from the state nuclear regulatory agency. So you answer to the state in these cases, and there is something that we call a nuclear regulatory commission. And this is abbreviated as the NRC. So the Nuclear Regulatory Commission will kind of give a general overview about radioactivity, what is a radioactive reagent, what is a radioactive waste, general overviews of how you should handle it, what you should do in a laboratory, and then the state nuclear regulatory agency will come in and step in at that point and say, this is how we are going to tell you to dispose and handle of these radioactive materials. The lab must be licensed. That's what some people do not understand. If you have any type of radioactive reagents or instrumentation, no matter how small, the lab has to be licensed by the NRC. So you have to put in paperwork, you have to tell them what you're going to be using, you have to tell them how much you're going to be using and what is present. And then the NRC will review that application, and the NRC will give you a license. And that license will permit you in having those radioactive reagents or the radioactive pieces of equipment on site. And they also will file basically documentation. And the documentation will go into play with a radio or radiation safety program. So this is basically twofold. Once you're on the list, they can come around and they can inspect you for radioactivity and how you're handling and what you're doing with it. Once you're on the list, you're also going to have to implement a radiation safety program at your location. So the people that are exposed to the radioactive substances or instrumentation, they have to be given a training program, just like chemical hygiene or just like workplace safety. They have to go through those training seminars. You have to keep that documentation on file to prove that they went through it. That way, everyone is aware of what they're getting exposed to on a daily basis. So, I'm going to stop the video here. We probably have one more, maybe, to go through. And we'll pick that up in the next video, and we'll continue on with this discussion of radioactivity.